Please note that this event is being recorded and may be rebroadcast on social media or other channels. Please welcome Mr. Mohamed Hammoud, Chief Learning Officer, New Canadian Media.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. And Tim, thank you for all the work you've done to make today possible for us. So welcome. This is the second collaboration between New Canadian Media and Seneca College. We're very excited to have the opportunity to partner once again with journalism schools. Today's workshop will focus on how we can spotlight immigrant experiences and amplify the stories that aren't being told. We will have with us three industry experts who will share their perspectives and best practices. Samya Madwar will explore how you can learn different perspectives when pursuing a story, how you can learn to listen better and develop an impactful story. We'll hear from Medford on how to ask those important questions, how to critically and not only put good questions together, but draw them out. And finally, we'll hear from Oomen on how to develop contact. After all, without good contact, you can't develop those perspectives or write stories that need to be told. We hope you can walk away today being more informed, empowered, with options on how you can learn, listen, and lead, and make a difference with the stories you will write, the perspectives you will share, and the voices you will amplify around the immigrant experience in Canada. So what does the program look like today? As mentioned, we'll have three wonderful speakers for 15 minutes each, with about 5 minutes between each speaker for Q&A. We'll have more time after our last speaker for more Q&A. We'll also need your input on providing feedback by taking a short survey a few minutes before we end today's session. In a moment, we'll hear from Damila Ani, but first, let's listen to Kurt Muller, Dean, Faculty of Communications, Art and Design. Kurt, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted that Seneca, Humber, and New Canadian Media have partnered on this event. As an immigrant myself and as a former journalist, I believe it is crucial that we highlight stories by and about immigrant communities. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement for the Seneca College campuses of Newnham, Seneca at York, Seneca Downtown, Markham, and the King campus, which also includes the Williams Treaty. Seneca would like to acknowledge the land on which its buildings are housed and where students, faculty, support staff, and members of the public gather. This land is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We are guests on this space, and it is our shared obligation to respect, honor, and sustain this land. The cities of Etobicoke, Toronto, North York, York, and Vaughan are located within the boundaries of the Toronto Purchase Treaty lands. Today, as we reflect on communities that have been underrepresented in Canadian media, I urge you to think about what it means to acknowledge the legacy of colonialism and the way in which the stories and history of Indigenous peoples have been suppressed and distorted. What are some of the privileges settlers enjoy today because of colonialism? And what can you do to develop relationships with the peoples on whose territory you are living? I'm looking forward to today's discussion and hearing from our esteemed speakers.
Thank you so much, Kurt, for sharing with us a message that is so important today and always. A message that's always been important, but a message that's resonating with us today because of what's going on. And you are part of that journey and part of that message. After all, as students in journalism, you're learning what the value of that message is, how you can impact it, how you can influence that message while staying relatively neutral to sharing it with your audience. Today, we're going to be talking about these stories and sharing messages that need to be told, different perspectives and different stories. Thank you, Kurt, for reminding us that we are all immigrants on this land. I now introduce to you Damila Ani, a Nigerian journalist who started her career in radio at one of the leading radio stations in Nigeria. Starting as a news reporter, she soon added news producer to her credentials and anchor to her portfolio. Before deciding to do radio, Damila worked in the newspaper and television industry. Damila, over to you.
Hello, my name is Damila Ani and I am a journalism student at Seneca College. I'm also an immigrant journalist who immigrated to Canada in 2019. I've literally been here for almost 2 years. Now, as an immigrant, I consider myself to be a first generation immigrant because I'm the first of my family to do something like this. But nobody tells you how difficult and challenging the journey could turn out to be. Of course, you're doing something, you expect challenges, you expect successes, but things could really, really go wrong. And when it does, you have just yourself to fix it. Nobody told me when I was coming here that my 5 years of radio experience would not be recognized. But thankfully, I was coming to Canada as a student, so I had time to learn about the journalism field here. I was able to liaise with professors. I was able to ask questions. I had people there to ask all of these questions that I wasn't understanding. And I took literally every opportunity that was being offered to me. In January, I had to do an unpaid internship for 4 months for grades in school, which I kind of didn't think I needed because I had all this wealth of experience, but I had to do it. And around that same time, in February, I was privileged to host the NCM, the Walrus, and Seneca College's workshop for immigrant journalists. I'm glad I did the unpaid internship in the end because it also exposed me to how journalism works, how a newsroom works in Canada, because there were so many things that I didn't know from back home. And at the NCM workshop, I was exposed to so many things that I had been doing wrong in my job application process. And of course, we know the pandemic hit. When the pandemic hit, I took it as an opportunity. I had just come out of the workshop in February. In March, the pandemic hit. So, everything was still fresh in my head. I put myself out there. I took it as an opportunity to put myself out there. There were jobs. I applied for them. And at the workshop in February, Yalda Sadakova, she was one of the speakers. She kept reiterating, she kept saying it. The worst any employer can tell you is no. And that really, really stayed with me. It wasn't something I hadn't heard before, but it really, really stayed with me. And I kept with it. Like in all my job application process, I kept thinking about it. The worst anybody can tell me is no. The worst anybody can tell me is no. And today, I am working in my field as a podcast producer. All of the jobs I applied to, I was offered all of the jobs. I was offered jobs in one of the big threes. But of course, because of the pandemic, being an international student, I'm delayed in school, so I can't work full time. But I know that if I was able to work full time, the job was mine because I was offered the job. There are jobs out there. And like I said at the workshop in February, if you have to do an unpaid internship to get your foot in the door, do it. You have nothing to lose in the long run. I'm not saying do an unpaid internship for years on end. But if you have to do a 4-month unpaid internship, do it. Because it would expose you to how the job is done here. The job is done almost the same everywhere, but there are differences. There are similarities and there are differences. So get your foot in the door, because once your foot is in the door, it's difficult for anyone to take it out again. And dream big, because why not? Dream big, dream of things that you want and go after it. Commitment, consistency cannot be overemphasized. I know it can be difficult, trust me. I started applying for journalism jobs even before I came here, and it took up until July 2020 for me to get a job in my field. It could be longer for so many other people, but dream big, because why not? The worst any employer can tell you is no. I do really, really wish you all the best, and I know that it can happen because it did happen for me. The sky is really just a stepping stone, and keep climbing. Keep climbing and keep keeping at it. Once again, I wish you all the very best. Thanks for having me. Bye.
Damila, thank you so much. Truly, the sky is a stepping stone. Why not? Why not have that attitude? As Damila inspired us to really think about dreaming big. We know that doesn't come without hard work and dedication, without consistency and commitment. And you know all about that. You're working hard, trying to do your best in your studies, trying to create relationships with people with whom you're studying. But remember, part of the message that Damila shared, it's so important to create these relationships, not only with fellow students, but people who are also able to help you learn and help you grow. This is the reason New Canadian Media, in learning and sharing ideas about the immigrant pulse in Canada, we've recognized the importance of partnering with the different journalism schools. We did last year with Algonquin, and we did with Seneca, and we're back this year because we believe in partnerships. We believe that the way to tell the stories that aren't being told at all or enough is to encourage the new storytellers, you, on how to tell these stories and how to do it effectively and how to put your commitment and consistency and to use the sky as that stepping stone to really bring your dreams and the dreams of those voices that have stayed silent for far too long to the foreground, and to allow us, the rest of us, to listen and to hear them and to feel them and to live them. After all, it is a shared humanity, and your lived experience is one that we want to learn. And we do that by being open to perspectives. And that's what we're going to learn about next. We're going to hear from Samya Madwar. Samya is the managing editor at the Walrus. She also serves on the board of directors at Magazines Canada and on the editorial board of Inuit Art Quarterly. Samya will be sharing her insight on how you can learn different perspectives when pursuing a story, how you can learn to listen better and develop an impactful story. Samya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mohamed. Damila is a tough act to follow, but I'm going to do my best here. Thank you very much for that introduction and also for that question. I really appreciate it because I think diversity is a word that's a little bit overused to the point of having lost its meaning. Oftentimes, it's a word that we throw around. And I like to take a step back when that happens and think, what actually are we trying to say when we talk about diversity and inclusion in this case? And so I really like the question of how can we be more inclusive of various perspectives in our journalism? And so, taking that step back and unpacking language is something that I'm going to be focusing on in the next 15 minutes. And of course, my presentation is not comprehensive. I can't touch on all of the different ways that you can bring in diverse perspectives into your journalism. I'm just going to focus on some of the lessons that I've learned in recent years through my work in journalism. And I'm going to refer a lot to writing because that's the world I come from. I work in magazines, but also because to me, language and writing both similarly are not just about putting words on a page or thinking about word choice or thinking about sentence structure. That's just one part of the writing process, but there's so much more that goes into it. There are so many more decisions, whether they're conscious decisions or unconscious decisions around who tells a story, what are the voices that you cite in the story, what are the numbers that you cite, how do you talk about a community? And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. That first point, who is telling the story and what sources that you cite, that's been something that I think a lot of media organizations have been thinking about, especially in 2020. But a lot of this work began before the Black Lives Matter protests that really forced a lot of organizations, media organizations included, to really think about diversity and inclusion. So for instance, in January of this year, the Canadian Association of Black Journalists and Canadian Journalists of Color released their calls to action to Canadian newsrooms, encouraging them, urging them to work on being more inclusive. And their first call to action was for outlets to track their newsroom demographics. That means that, if you're an organization that really does care about diversity and inclusion, then it begins with yourself, with who do you hire, who are your reporters, but also who are your editors, your producers, your managers, who are the people who are making the decisions, because that's really important as well. And there's been some progress on that for Canadian media, and both CABJ and CJOC are now meeting with various news outlets, including the Walrus, to track their progress on meeting those calls to action. But U.S. media have been doing this work for far longer, and they're actually quite a bit ahead. So I'd like to cite an example from, one example that I like, and it comes from NPR's Shortwave, which is a science show, and science shows are very close to my heart. Last December, the host, Maddie Safaya, tweeted a thread about how she and her colleagues track the diversity of their sources in their stories. And one thing they do, and the reason that I like this example, is that first they start with a script. So when they interview a source, this part doesn't necessarily make it to air. It's just kind of in the background, but they'll ask their source if they can, ask them how they identify. So they'll ask things like their age, what region in the U.S. they live in. Again, this is a U.S. show. But they'll also ask them to identify in terms of race and gender identity. And there are a couple of important things here. One is that they enter this information into a spreadsheet, which is not a fancy tool. And so if your newsroom doesn't quite do that yet, or if you're a freelancer, it's something that you can easily set up and start incorporating into your own work. The other thing is that they have a script where they explain why they're tracking this information. So they're not just asking these questions for the sake of it, but they're doing it so that they can later analyze, how diverse are their sources? And that doesn't just include race and ethnicity and age, it's also regional. They want to make sure that because they're a national show, they want to represent all of America and not just New York, for instance, or the big cities. The other thing is that they ask people to self-identify. Now, some of you might have had this experience, I certainly have, where I was filling out a form and I was asked to identify race or ethnicity, and I didn't see myself in the categories listed, when there's a drop-down menu or there's, some options and you have to take them off. And so often I've had to take off the choice other because I just didn't fit in. And so it's very good to have that option to be asked, how do you identify, and to be able to supply your own answer. And, of course, diversity is not just about race and ethnicity. As I said, there's regional diversity, but there are other things, and this is something that I personally am really trying to work on, is am I being inclusive enough of people with disabilities? That's one area that I don't feel equipped to teach about because I'm still learning quite a bit. But it's just something that I really wanted to touch on because I think it's often forgotten. And, trying to be more inclusive of one group often has positive downstream effects, and you can be more inclusive of everyone when you try to take those extra steps. So it's always just a positive approach and a positive way to do that. One thing that I worry about a little bit, and this, I just kind of want to think critically about this, is when you're collecting this kind of data is to think about what are the categories that we're thinking about. And one danger with categories, there's a lot of scholarship on this, is that something like race, for instance, is a social construct. It's not actually really a biological fact about people. It's a category that people invented really as a tool of oppression, of using physical differences between people as a way to justify committing violence against them or oppressing them. That's something to keep in mind, and that's why it's very important to be transparent with people about why you're collecting this information, because so often it's used to discriminate against people, not to be more inclusive of them. And so it's very important to be transparent, but it's also important not to assume things about people. And so earlier I was talking about, selecting from a drop-down menu of how you identify. One experience I have had personally is wondering about the term person of color. And I first heard it when I was an intern in a Canadian magazine a number of years ago. I was relatively new to Canada at that point as an adult, and I hadn't heard the term before. And the person who used it wasn't talking about me, but over time I realized that people do think of me as a person of color. And when I looked it up, I realized that there are reasons that term exists, and there are very legitimate ones, and there are people who identify that way. But the reason that I had trouble with it was because I don't primarily identify in terms of my race or ethnicity or the color of my skin, but more in terms of geography and citizenship. So I identify as Syrian Canadian because my family is Syrian and I grew up in Syria, and I speak some Arabic at home. But at the same time, I was born in Canada and I have spent most of my adult life in Canada. So I really do identify with both places. And so I much prefer to be able to identify myself rather than having to choose from a category or letting other people kind of make assumptions about where I'm from. And the reason that I'm sharing this is because I realized, in going through this thought process, I realized I'm probably doing this to other people too, is that either overtly or subconsciously, I'm placing people into categories that they themselves might not identify with. And that's why, I keep coming back to, it's always better to ask. And what better tool for journalists or asking questions anyway, is to just ask one more question. And people are usually very, very welcoming of that and very receptive and grateful to be asked. There are other terms that I want to call attention to, things like visible minority, which thankfully is falling out of use. But again, I just, question it because this focus on visible differences is problematic to me. Another term that's been criticized recently is BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color. In a piece in Chatelaine recently, the writer Thierry Daniel, I'm just reading off the screen here, questions the term BIPOC, and one of her interviewees, Rhonda C. George, says, quote, "It is more clear to be specific about the group that you're referring to. If you're talking about Black people, just say Black." And that's really important, this idea of being more specific. It's something that I'm an editor and I tell my writers often, can you be more specific? Can you be more specific? It's a principle that can be applied widely. For instance, when writing about Indigenous stories, you could be more specific there. So in an essay for the Walrus in 2017, two writers, Mel Lefebvre, who identifies as Métis, and Alicia Elliott, who identifies as Tuscarora, they question the term Indigenous because it's something that's imposed on them, and it came from a settler colonial system that sought to categorize people as Indigenous based on parameters that really weren't fitting. So they used things like blood quantum, where a lot of Indigenous communities don't really think about blood quantum in terms of their identity. And so they, again, encourage people to be more specific. Let's do away with terms like, let's try to move away from terms like Indigenous and really identify people according to the community they identify with. JHR, Journalists for Human Rights, issued a style guide a couple of years ago that very much urges people to do the same thing. So it's a style guide on Indigenous reporting, and it's written by reporter Lenny Carpenter, who urges journalists to, again, be more specific. Instead of saying Indigenous, you can say First Nations, Métis, or Inuit where appropriate. But also, instead of saying First Nations, there are more than 600 First Nations in this land that some people call Canada. Which one are you referring to, or which ones? And so it's always important to go that one step further. Another problem with categorizing is that there's a tendency to ask people to kind of identify in terms of their community rather than as individuals. And a recent example of this is in the US election, where a lot of people were saying, well, the pollsters got it wrong about where the Black vote would go or how Latinx people would vote. And a lot of the response to that was, well, we're not a monolith. Not all Latinx voters think alike. And so it's also just very important. I myself have been interviewed as a Syrian Canadian, and I often found that I was kind of being asked to represent all Syrians. And I kept trying to explain, I'm just one Syrian, and I definitely don't have a typical experience of Syrians. I'm going to skip ahead just because I don't want to take up all of the time. But one thing that I think about too is just how international events are covered in Canadian media. And so there's often a lens that placed on international stories of, how does this relate to Canada? Could it happen here? And I saw two troubling examples in this past year when the BLM protests were spreading around the world. A lot of Canadian media, and I'm not going to point to a specific example because I think this is an industry-wide problem. They would interview, for instance, Black Canadians and ask them, how do you feel about this? Another example is after the explosion in Beirut in Lebanon in August, where dozens of people were killed and thousands were displaced and injured. Lebanese Canadians were asked, how are you reacting? How do you feel? And I feel that that is a shortcut. It's asking a lot of people who are, witnesses to tragedy to tell the story rather than journalists going out and doing the reporting and providing the context. And the reason I bring this up here is because I think it really restricts the idea of what a Canadian story is. So when we're thinking about diversifying perspectives, I think it's also important to broaden the idea of what is a Canadian story and what matters to Canadians. Because I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one here on this panel today or among the audience who cares about world events, not because there's a Canadian angle necessarily, but because it's happening in the world that we all live in. And especially as journalists, I think that should be something that we all think about. And it's ironic that we restrict ourselves when we think about what is Canadian because Canada is so diverse. 20% of Canadians speak a language other than English or French at home. And so that's one thing to think about is one thing we started doing at the Walrus is when we have a non-English word in a story is we no longer italicize it as we used to because we want to normalize the use of non-English languages. English is not necessarily the neutral language, it's just the dominant one. Another thing to think about is that numbers are also part of language. And so when we're citing statistics about a community, so often with underrepresented communities, it's always negative statistics that are cited. So there's always a context paragraph that cites homicide rates and poverty rates and homelessness rates and things like that. Sometimes those are crucial and they're very much a part of the story and the context. But when those are the same numbers that we're always citing about a community, it further marginalizes that community. And so I really want to think about how can we tell stories about communities that really represent not just one perspective of that community, but really a broader perspective of that community. I want to end on a positive note. One of the goals that I have is to allow writers from underrepresented communities to tell the stories that they want to tell. And so one example of that we started doing at the Walrus is this past summer in June, we launched Terra Cosmeta, which is a series that is guest edited by Robert Jago, who is part of the Kwantlen First Nation. And he invited Indigenous writers. I'm going to use the broad term because he does have Métis and First Nations writers, and it's an ongoing series, so he's going to be inviting more, to tell the stories that they want to tell, where they don't have to explain quote unquote Indigenous issues to non-Indigenous people, but really just tell the stories that they're interested in. And that's something that I am hoping to try to do more and more of, is really invite people from underrepresented communities to not necessarily always write about discrimination against them, but always to tell the stories that they want to. And if I can end on anything, it's that inclusion is not necessarily an embellishment or something that's, it's not just a bonus. It's not something that's, a decorative addition to your journalism. Being more inclusive makes your journalism better. It's just higher quality, and it makes your stories more accurate. And another thing to bear in mind is that language is not static; it changes. And so I think it's never too late to be broadening our perspectives and to think more critically about the language that we use. It's an ongoing learning process. And that is it for me. Back to you, Mohamed.
Samya, thank you so much. There's so much to unpack, and I will respectfully say that maybe not enough time. We want to make sure that we give the opportunity for participants to ask questions. I know there isn't any questions in the Q&A just yet, but I encourage you, if you have any questions, please start putting them in there. Samya, you shared so much, and you helped us understand that in the absence of empowering groups, empowering communities to tell their stories, when we're not doing that, there's a sort of oppression. You mentioned oppression, and that's powerful, because when voices aren't heard, as Kurt reminded us in his, when we, we're recognizing the land that we're on, the land, just that we are here, but we are not on land that belongs to us, and yet we have become those who own the mic. We get to set the standards for what is shared. And media today, it's not inclusive. Earlier this year when we had the event at Seneca, a colleague of mine, one of the keynote speakers, reminded me that diversity is a choice, diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. And that's a powerful statement. But to go a bit further, we can recognize the diversity that's all around us. It exists whether or not we want to be aware of it. We have to make a conscious choice to be inclusive. But sitting at the table and breaking bread with someone and allowing them to take bread from you and to give it to you, that's belonging. And when we help others, when we amplify the voices of others, when we allow them, as Samya was saying, to tell the stories in the way that they want to tell the stories, and not for us to ask them or tell them which stories we want to hear, that is truly belonging. And you, as students in journalism, I ask you to question, why are you in this? Why are you studying to become a journalist? What stories do you want to tell, and what perspectives do you want to share? And keep asking yourself, drill down, why am I doing this? And when you get the answer, ask yourself again, why am I doing this? Till you get to your personal mission, and that's going to help drive you and where you go. And people will pick up on that, because as you develop your voice and your perspective, you're going to do so in a way that's inclusive and help others belong. And that's really, really important. So I want to make sure that we also give opportunity for questions. So again, there haven't been any questions. If you're not brave enough to share any questions yet, or you don't know what you want to ask, we're going to come back at the end of the session after Isaac speaks, and we'll give you an opportunity then. If you're more comfortable taking notes right now and then sharing at the when we have an open forum, that's fine as well. So again, I'm looking in the Q&A. There's nothing there, so that's cue for me to move forward and introduce our next speaker, and that's Marcus. Marcus Medford. Who is Marcus? Well, let me tell you a bit about Marcus, because not only does he come with a wonderful smile and a wonderful laugh along with that, but Marcus actually brings a lot of background on the topics that we're talking about today. And he's going to share with you on how to ask important questions. So if Samya was helping you understand the importance of perspectives, Marcus is going to give you some input on how you can ask those questions and how to draw them out and think critically so you can share those perspectives. Marcus is a freelance journalist. He's born and raised right here in Toronto. He's worked as an editor, a content writer, a panel moderator, and in many other roles, by the way. And Marcus is also a 2-time TEDx performer and the author of a poetry collection, The Book of Mars. Marcus, please share your insight with us.
Hello. Thank you so much for that intro. I did laugh when you mentioned my laugh, so thank you for that. I'm happy, excited to be here. Very much looking forward to getting into this chat, and I do hope that I'm able to give you some valuable insights as to how you can ask important questions, not only to understand your subject, but how to ask important questions of the people that you're interviewing and how to ask important questions of the data that you are receiving from press releases and things like that. So a little bit of background about me. My educational background is in journalism and philosophy, and I like to joke that because of that background, I'm an incessantly inquisitive person. I have a lot of questions floating around in my head, but when it comes to journalism, that curiosity is a good thing because it normally leads to critical thinking. And the first step to asking good questions is to get a good understanding of the subject that you're going to be writing about. In a philosophical debate, or if you are writing a philosophy essay for a course, before you even begin to argue your position, the first thing that you must do is you must define the facts and the details, and then you lay out your problem. And I think that this is really important when it comes to telling stories that are going beyond reporting that there was a fire here, there was a break-in here, because you need to have that big picture, critical thinking understanding of a problem to really make it make sense and to make the impact stand out more. As Mohamed mentioned, I have worked as a editor, and in my time as an editor, one of the most frustrating things is reading someone's article and coming away from it thinking, why did I just read that? And I of course, am not intending that to be rude, but when I read some of these articles, it felt like the article didn't have a central focus. And because it didn't have a focus, the rest of the article was, it was built around something that made it rambly, and it didn't make a ton of sense. So when it comes to putting together an article, the first step is getting a thorough understanding of your subject and laying out all the relevant facts, which means that you need to answer your W5H questions. For those of you who don't know, W5H stands for who, what, where, when, why, and how. And as I mentioned earlier, not only are these questions that will help you ask your interviewees good questions and get them to really share their knowledge and dive into their perspectives, because I know that that is one of the focuses here, how we can tell stories that are untold and how we can explore perspectives that are not often explored or that are important. But when you have done this thorough research and background work before you ask your questions, you will also be able to shape your story, and having the answers to these questions will also inform how you can or should go about putting those stories together. So the first thing I think that would be helpful to do is talk about the critical thinking questions and components that are associated with each of the W5H questions. This list that I'm about to give is by no means exhaustive. There are more examples that you could come up with. Sometimes the questions that you will ask related to the W5H will depend on the story that you're writing, but this is my kind of general overview. So who are the people you need to interview? What do you need to quote or cite, or who do you need to quote or cite rather? And who has said something about the topic before? I think the most important thing to note and to actually put into practice when it comes to who are the people that you need to interview. Samya touched on this a little bit in her presentation, but it's important that if you're writing a story about a particular group of people, whether this is an ethnic group, a sexual orientation group, or people that are from a specific city, for example, you want to make sure that the people that you're writing about are included in the story as more than just the subject. You want to make sure that you are actually talking to people in this community. If there is something that affects the community, you should talk to someone who is directly affected by that situation. If we wanted to look at the lobster situation that's happening out in Nova Scotia with the Mi'kmaq people, you want to talk to you don't want to just talk to someone off the street about something like that, because not everyone is fully informed about that. And it's not necessarily sufficient to just talk to someone who is from an Indigenous community, because as Samya pointed out, that there are a lot of different nations and tribes and different groupings within that. So it's not a homogeneous group. So you want to make sure that you're talking to someone who is actually directly affected by the decisions that are being made about the events that are happening. You also want to talk to experts, but I think what is very important to emphasize, especially when you're talking about racialized communities, is not to rely solely on these academic experts. A lot of times marginalized communities are kept out of academia, or their types of knowledge are not valued in the same way for various reasons. So you want to make sure that you have that balance of talking to real life, regular people, and then talking to people who would know this stuff. I know that, for example, when I was listening to election coverage, one of the people that they had talking on was a former U.S.-Canada ambassador. That is the perfect kind of person to talk about how the U.S. election, and depending on which president was elected, how that would affect Canada and our relationship in terms of policy and relationships between the actual leaders. So that is something that is really important to look at the perspective, and then to also take into account agency and power dynamics when you are looking for people to talk to. And it's also important to remember on that note that when you are talking to a community, unless someone is from a group that represents that whole community, that just talking to one person who is one Mi'kmaq person does not mean that you have the official opinion and status on the entire community, because people have different perspectives. When it comes to who do you need to cite or quote, this is important because you want to go for official bodies. StatsCan is a great resource to cite. If you are in a specific city like Toronto, for example, looking at the data that they collect is more valuable than looking at the data collected by, say, just a newspaper. You want to get the most official stats and numbers that you can. You want to make sure that they are up to date as possible. And another thing that's important is the people that are involved. If, for example, Facebook makes an announcement, you are not going to quote something necessarily from someone who's involved in Twitter. You definitely want to get something from Mark Zuckerberg. You would probably want to get something from the head of Facebook Canada. People that are closely involved to the story, those are the people that you want to cite. And if you were going to be asking interviewees who are not the people who made these announcements, you want to make sure that you are giving them an opportunity to respond to publicly available information, and information that kind of best summarizes the whole situation. And that also kind of falls into the who has said something about this issue before. Moving on to what is the story? What is happening right now? What does this mean going forward? What are you trying to argue, and what are you trying to find out? And I think what is very important about what is the story is when you are looking at a piece of news. There is the story on the surface. This is what is happening now. But what does this mean going forward, and what are the larger implications? That is a separate story. I'll take the example of the rising numbers that we saw here in Toronto in early to mid-September, when there were more cases of COVID being found, and they were being found in racialized communities. So on the surface, that is one story. There are surging numbers of COVID, and these are the areas that it's happening. So what you want to do to build on that and to involve critical thinking into that process is think about, what does that mean? What does that mean going forward? What does that mean for for transit, in terms of like how many people are allowed on buses in this area? Looking at what does it mean for the bars and restaurants and businesses that are in that area? Because if there are going to be extended lockdowns, what is this going to mean for the people that are living there? You want to find out not just what is happening now, but what is happening now and how that will affect things going forward. The question of what are you trying to argue? This is obviously something that will apply more to commentary writing and opinion writing as opposed to straight up news reporting. But you want to make sure that you have a firm understanding of what you are arguing. You want to, as I mentioned, have a thorough understanding of the whole problem, what it means now, the implications, the history of something is also very important. What you are trying to find out, this is something that is very important for when you're speaking to people. What you're trying to find out is usually information or perspective. You want to talk to people, as I mentioned before, who are closely involved in the stories, and what you're trying to find out is what they know and how their knowledge would help the public more generally understand this issue. Whether that is something that's looking at zoning, whether you are trying to find out from a nurse or from a doctor how COVID is affecting people. Knowing what you are trying to find out and going into your conversations and going into your research with a clear idea of what that is will help you have a conversation that's more structured, and you will get more out of it because you will spend less time with answers that don't answer the central question of your article. Where else has this thing happened? Where did the thing happen, and where else is it happening, or has it happened? This again is looking at larger trends and correlations. I know that when I was in journalism school, that one of the examples that we got is you could look at a car accident that happens at an intersection, but the more important and more interesting, and the question that will help people more going forward in terms of their decision making, is when else has it happened? When else has it happened there? If you have an intersection and there's a car crash there, that's not great, but so you have that information. But you want to look at the larger picture, like what else has happened there. If you're noticing, for example, that there are 700 car crashes that happen in this one intersection, where when you look at the other intersections around the city, there's 300. So there's 400 more intersections happening at that specific intersection. And then that becomes your story. Your story is no longer the fact that there was an accident. Your story is the fact that that has happened there. And then you can start getting into why are accidents happening there? How long, when did more accidents start to happen there? And then it could become a story about traffic. It could be a story about traffic, a story about driving, a story about pedestrians. That story is more valuable than just knowing that there was a car crash at some intersection, so you need to avoid it. the more expanded story, that will help people make decisions. So that is a big one. When it comes to the where of asking important questions, you also want to look at different regional things. Again, if we want to talk about COVID, you could write something that has to do with the differences between Peel region and Toronto in terms of the restrictions that are put in place. But a more interesting way to look at that is, how are these restrictions going to affect these communities on a long-term basis in terms of small businesses, in terms of transportation and things like that. So that's just one of the ways that you can take a piece of information and dive into it further to pull out something that is more interesting and more useful. When it comes to when, questions you want to ask is, when is the most relevant data published? When did the flashpoint happen? And the flashpoint is just the new piece of news. It doesn't have to be something happening per se. It could be someone said something. It could be an anniversary is reached. But that is something that you want to ask. When did this happen? And again, going back to the car crash example, but when was the last time something like this happened? That is an important question to ask when you're looking at big types of events. If you wanted to look at, say, like a mass shooting or some act of terrorism, it's important to not only look at that event as an event, but no event exists in a vacuum. So you want to make sure that you are paying close attention and addressing how often things are happening. If you have a whole line of incidents, you can look that maybe there was 8 incidents between 2014 and 2016, but then there's been 16 incidents between 2016 and 2020. So when was the last time that something happened, and when did the increase start? Once you have that information, then you can dive further, look into statistics, look at motivations for these things, outcomes that have come from either arrest or court rulings and things like that. And these are ways to kind of deepen your thinking and to dive into the question a little more. Why? Why does this matter? Why are you telling the story now? Why is this thing happening? And why is this important to my community or to a specific community? Why are you telling something now is not only important for putting the story together, but for those of you who are planning to pitch your stories to new news organizations, this is something that they are using to assess your pitch. Why are you telling it now? Why is this something that needs to be told now? And often the reason is because something just happened. The Prime Minister just made an announcement about funding. So the reason I'm writing about this now is because this is going to affect people, and this announcement was just made. Sometimes it is more difficult to have a story that is related to, that isn't tied to a specific event. So if you are planning to write something that isn't tied to an event, you need to make sure that your pitch is solid and you can be very convincing as to why the editors and why an audience would be interested in this story now. Why does this matter? History is a big part of why does it matter. You want to look at other instances that has happened, the larger effects of this ruling or of this event, and you want to be able to tie it to different events in the past. I know that this past summer I wrote an article after the Associated Press and other publications in North America made the decision to capitalize B in Black when referring to people's race. And so why does the story matter now? That story mattered now because the decision was made, but the story mattered more because almost 100 years ago, there was a similar argument that happened with publications between people like Alex Baldwin in the New York Times, arguing that to use a lowercase letter for millions of people is an act of disrespect, and it doesn't treat people or it doesn't see people as humans the way it does for groups like Latinos or Native Americans. So that is why the story matters now, and that is why the story matters in a larger context. Again, so those are just things to make your story more interesting, and there are looking into that history can make your argument more compelling. Last but not least is how. How is this able to happen? How do you know what you know? And how is the most recent incident an example of a larger trend? So with how, a lot of the how questions are addressed in other questions, like for example, how do you know what you know? How do you know what you know will have to do with the sources that you gather, where you're getting your statistics from, where are you getting your quotes from? How do you know what you know? When you've actually spoken to someone, you will know something because you've spoken to an expert about it. You've spoken to someone who is from the organization that did the study or made the press release or was involved in some ruling, some donation or something. So how do you know what you know is about your sources, both the people that you talk to and the information that you gather. How is this able to happen? That is something that normally I would say looks at policies, decisions, rulings that have changed. And again, this is something that will help give you a larger perspective of what is happening. So those are all of the points related to W5H. But the last thing that I wanted to do before we got into the Q&A is to look at some examples. For example, back in September, when they were
Marcus?
made. Hi.
Sorry, we're just we want to remind you that you've got 15 minutes. You're just a little over time, but can we maybe move into some of the questions that are coming in from our guests?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And I know that in the short span of 15 minutes, it's really hard to share all the knowledge, but we're also going to be able to share some of that. So if there are more examples that you want to help surface, maybe we can come to it when we have the general Q&A at the end.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Happy to take questions now.
All right. So there's a lot that you shared with us, Marcus. Really appreciate that. And some of the things that you talked about, obviously the 5 W's and the H, this is going to help you structure your story, help you structure how you're going to ask the question so you can get to the perspectives that we want to establish. And it's going to help you tell the story not only in a more structured way, but it's going to get the answers that you're looking for. So it's drawing those answers out. If you show up here, you're not prepared, and you're just there to tell any story, well, guess what? You're not going to get a story that's actually going to be salient. And so it's really important, as you mentioned, to show up, know what it is that you want to ask, and then be able to draw those answers out by asking the right questions. So we do have some questions that have been coming in. So any new advice for reporters joining an organization that lacks diversity or have gaps? We're going to come to that particular question maybe when we open it up a little later. Let's see if there's any questions, particularly about how we ask the questions. What is the first or most important W5 questions that you answer? So maybe you can share some insight on that, Marcus.
The first or most important question. So I would say the most important question is why does this matter? And again, I think what is a key thing to look at is why does this matter now in terms of what's happening right now, and why does this matter in terms of the larger picture, bigger perspective. So I think why does this matter is the most important question, but because it is the most important question, it is in some ways the most difficult. In some ways, it's easier to get to answer some of the other questions. I think what the easiest thing to do is probably who. Like as I'm thinking about it, figuring out who you want to talk to, that is very important. I think that that will help give your story direction. Also, who are you getting your information from? What sources are you citing? I think that those are the places that you need to start. I think that why does this matter is important for everything, and I think that that is the most important for when you're actually writing the story, because as I said, writing a story, if it doesn't have a focus, you can tell that this person has not clearly articulated why this matters. And you need to do that as a writer, because if you're not able to say why something matters, your editor is not going to be able to see why it matters. And the person who's reading your article is not going to read all of it, because they're going to get through it and realize this is not important. It doesn't matter to me. You need to make it clear to the person reading it why something matters. So I would say that that is the first place to start.
Thank you, Marcus. Really appreciate you sharing the insight. And as I mentioned, there are a few more questions that are more general questions that we're going to turn over to our panelists at the end. But now we're going to move along, and we're going to hear from our third speaker, our final speaker, and definitely not the last of the speakers. So thank you very much, Isaac. Isaac Oomen works in curricula design for post-secondary education and is co-founder of Solid State Industries, an immigrant youth co-op in Surrey, BC. He's also an editor and writer for New Canadian Media, as well as co-founder of the now defunct Vancouver Media Co-op. Isaac will be sharing his insight on how to develop contacts. And that, just building on what we were listening to with Marcus about the who, is really important. So Isaac, over to you.
Thanks so much, Mohamed. And thanks everyone else for starting these off. Super stoked to speak at this particular point. Before I do begin, I also want to acknowledge, of course, the territories on which I'm standing here. Not Toronto, I'm in Vancouver, so I'm in the territories of the Coast Salish people, the unceded territories, I should be specific, of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So I'm going to be talking to you about how to develop contacts in journalism. And really, there's like a lot of places I could begin this presentation, but I'm going to start it here, outside of Canada, in India, actually. So back in January, I was hanging out in South India, mostly for work, but also just for leisure as well. And a friend of mine hit me up, and she was working for this publication called Towards Freedom, which is a sort of progressive journal based out of the Eastern United States. And one of the big things going on at the time was this thing called the CAA. I can go into a lot of details, but basically it was equivalent to what Harper did back during his time in Canadian politics, in that the sort of central government was trying to take away citizenship from anyone who's not born or can actually identify as being from India. Particularly, it was set up to take away citizenship from Muslims. And so my friend, who was an editor at the publication, asked me to go and cover it. A lot of times, and this is where the context is important, we think about, as Marcus says, who we speak to and why those voices are important. In this particular reason, I thought it was important to have Muslim voices, because those were the people being affected. And a lot of the coverage didn't really center around them, even though they were the ones being largely affected by that. So I popped in to one of the main cities, which is called Cochin. I kind of just randomly found a couple of Muslim organizations, went in, got a couple of really nice interviews, and just basically was able to pull all these together. Now, the reason I'm telling you the story, though, is it doesn't quite work like that over here in Canada. The idea of just like popping through, which I've done a lot actually whenever I'm in the Middle East or South Asia, just kind of popping into places, like calling people up, and things just seem to work out, isn't quite the same here. And I think really one of the things to remember is the importance of intention in going into an article. In this particular case, I did want Muslim voices, and that was very important. I didn't have a lot of context there. In contrast, here, one of the stories I can tell you is in terms of like my very first bit of coverage in terms of indigenous issues. So back in 2009, and going from what Kurt had talked about, the importance of acknowledgements, I'd come here as an immigrant in 2004. I didn't know really anything about anything indigenous. But at the time, there was a very important, similar to something that's going on right now, a struggle to do with land defense and also specifically fishing rights in the Chiam reservation, the reserve, which had to do with the Stalo people. Geographically, they're located in the sort of Hope area of the Lower Mainland. And I just heard about it, went over, did quite a bit of coverage. At the time, there was nothing at all. And at the time, I didn't really know anything about indigenous issues. I didn't even know that was like an entire category here of things that are going on as a new immigrant. But it really helped me think about things very differently. Even though I haven't covered indigenous issues in like years, I still think to this day, in terms of that sort of critical coverage and just in terms of whatever I even hear or watch, that's coverage coming out right now. So with that in mind, the person who kind of really got me into the idea of covering things on a sort of community basis is my good friend Don Paley, who's done a fair amount of coverage on Latin American issues here, but also now she's based out of Mexico and she does a lot of coverage there. The reason that's important when it comes to contacts is that's kind of how you develop contacts. Back in 2009, I went out to Chiam, developed a bunch of contacts that to this day are the people that I would go to if I needed to touch upon any coverage that has to do with land defense, fishing rights here in the Lower Mainland, and specifically in their region, the Stalo region, which is like the Abbotsford, Hope, Fraser Valley region. And in the same way, she's really good in terms of the coverage that she's doing, which is to do with, people's struggles in Latin America, particularly Mexico, which she's based out of. Now, the key thing there is she's not Mexican herself. She's actually a white girl from grew up in Maple Ridge here in the West Coast. But she's done this really great solidarity journalism because, one, she's based out of there, and two, she really feels the impact and need to do these to do this kind of coverage. So the things that she's looked at include missing and murdered women there in Mexico, particularly at the Mexico-U.S. border, as well as student protests against the government, austerity measures, and several other aspects of government there, as well as people's politics there. A lot to do, and a lot can't emphasize this enough, indigenous struggles there as well. So that's how she's kind of developed those contacts. She's got a lot there, and it's mostly got to do with the fact that she gives a lot of credence and underlines the voices of people who often aren't listened to, particularly indigenous people in Mexico, particularly women, particularly people who are affected by things such as the kidnappings and murders, while usually the media puts light to, the police and government. So in terms of that, I want to bring it back to Canada and specifically New Canadian Media. So over the past little bit, I've gotten to work with quite a few of our writers as doing some of the editing. And I'll highlight one person, which is Surjit Singh Flora, who's based out of Brampton. And he's done some phenomenal coverage for us, specifically of issues in Brampton. This particular one I have up here just happened to be his latest, and it's not necessarily got to do with Brampton or that area. But he especially is good as covering anything to do with South Asian communities and specifically the Punjabi community within the sort of Brampton, Greater Toronto area. And the reason he's able to do that, sort of opposite to my friend though, is that he's part of those communities. So he can get out there, he can cover a lot of ground, he can talk to a lot of different people that, a lot of us wouldn't have access to. And so these are probably much better examples of that, of covers that he's done. On the left, that's something that I've actually helped Surjit put together in terms of editing, is this kind of awesome piece of coverage of a candidate that just kind of disappeared, as you can tell by the headline, from being on the election ticket. And it's the sort of story, one, you wouldn't really think about, and then two, a lot of people wouldn't have access to. But because Surjit has those sort of contacts, he's really good at pulling those together already. On the right, also an important piece of coverage is something that Surjit looked at in terms of, and specifically New Canadian Media wanted to do a lot of stuff around youth. Another article around deportation. And again, here I'll come back to what Samya had said in terms of who we're talking to, because in both these cases and in many of those cases, Surjit actually manages to talk to a lot of folks that don't usually get coverage in the media. There are a lot of voices that don't usually get heard. And so that's where I think it's really important to have someone like him and do coverage like that. So what it boils down to really at the end is, when you're coming to the question of how to develop context, these are the sort of main questions. What communities do you represent? In one case, the ones that you're already part of. And also, which communities do you want to represent? And I'll use my own example that that was the second that I started with. Even though I'm not part of Indigenous communities, it's really nice to be able to develop context and contacts and context, because alongside that, those you also understand the importance of different perspectives, and particularly the perspectives of communities that don't usually get heard. From there, obviously, where you're involved, and this is where we come to the sort of community and solidarity aspect of things. So if you're involved with, organizations on one level and you believe in what they do, it becomes easy to develop contacts there. And most importantly, what stories are not being told about these communities? So again, just underlining a lot of what Samya and Marcus had said. They've said it much better than I have, but basically the sort of primary narratives that are out there and the sort of narratives we need to develop, particularly the narratives of those who don't often get represented. And that's basically it for me in terms of the presentation. And yeah, that's it for me in terms of everything I have in terms of context. I know it's kind of like a lot all over the place with that, because it's totally contextual depending on where you're trying to develop context. But yeah, if you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And I don't think you're giving yourself enough credit when we know something that's so close to what we're doing every day, but what you're sharing with others, including me, you're helping us understand the strategies that we need to develop, because how we actually can develop those contacts goes back to what Marcus was saying about, it's sure the why is important. We all, especially today, we think about the why. But if you start asking the why to the wrong person, or maybe the person who isn't the best one to ask your really structured questions, you could be wasting time. And we know today news has to be newsworthy. So we have to make sure that while we're getting ready to talk about what's really relevant and important, and especially timely, nobody wants to hear a story that somebody was covering 3 weeks ago, unless, as Marcus was saying, you've got the outcome, you've got a different twist to the story now, right? And that makes a story within itself. But it's coming back, developing those contacts, And also, I think something you mentioned, when we develop those contacts, they become trusted contacts that we can go to. They become ways that we can go back to that particular community. You know, a lot of time, especially when, you know, with New Canadian Media, we think that I have to be Muslim to report on something in the Muslim community. I have to be Black to, you know, report on something in the Black community. A really smart way to approach journalism and to tell the stories that need to be told is to realize if you have the right skill set, if you can develop the right lens through which you can share that perspective and make sure that it's heard, if you can structure your approach, as Marcus was telling us, and if you can develop those relationships, that story is going to resonate with a lot of people. And that's what I think a lot of the, you know, our colleagues on this call today, the students who are building their expertise and their, you know, toolbox of how do I do this, that's what they're going to take away from what you and Isaac and Samya shared with us. So thank you very much. I think now we're going to go to the panel discussion, if I'm not mistaken. Tim, you can correct me if I'm wrong. There are some questions and answers, some questions that require answers. So we're going to go to the Q&A, and I'm just going to ask my colleagues to turn on their camera. Some of these questions are pointed directly at one person. For example, I know there's one that came in for Marcus. I will be directing this to Marcus in a moment. And then what I'll ask my colleagues to do, if there's something that resonates, you think you've got something you would like to weigh in on, by all means, unmute yourself and share. What I do want to remind all of us is we have 10 minutes for the Q&A. We've got a few questions here. I'm going to start with the one that came in. Marcus, this is to you.
Okay.
From one of our listeners. And he'd like to know, where is it here? Just bear with me. How do we get started as a freelance journalist? And what's the first step? And how do we keep evolving? And again, a reminder to my colleagues, please be on time for your responses. Marcus, over to you.
It is a little difficult. I think that the best thing that you can do is before you get accepted anywhere, pitch anywhere you can. Research publications before you pitch to them, before you apply to them, so you have an idea of what subjects they do, what tone they take, what areas that they cover in terms of subject, and once you have got in, or once you have got feedback from managing editors and the people who are receiving pitches, is to follow up with them. If you have other stories in the future, maybe your first one didn't get accepted, but they might like your second one. They might just like the fact that you are constantly pitching things, because especially when you're starting off and you haven't got newsroom experience, or you haven't got experience doing daily news, one of the things that they value the most is someone who's able to create stories, someone who's able to see a piece of information and draw a story out of that. So if you're able to display that to people, that's something that is very valuable. Once you do get in somewhere, try and hold on. That is a good thing. Once you're able to make that connection, try to keep it. If people have an idea of what your strengths are in terms of your coverage area, the people that you were sending pitches to might then reach out to you and say, hey, we have this story that's dealing with this. I think that you would be a good fit for it, and making yourself available. I think that if you're balancing other careers, if journalism is what you want to do, if you need to set a shift aside so that you can work on a story, that is something I definitely would recommend that you do. I think you're muted.
Mohamed, your mic is off.
And so thank you. What I think that takes us back to what Damila was saying about consistency and commitment. You know, if you're going to dream big, if you're going to use the sky as a stepping stone, be consistent, and you will become the go-to person, hopefully, for the news outlet that maybe is going to carry your story. Thank you very much, Marcus. This is open to all my colleagues, but I think it may have come about because of the discussion from Samya on diversity. So the question is, any advice for new reporters who are joining organizations that lack diversity, have large gaps in covering diverse communities? Samya, maybe I'll get your take on this.
Sure. It's a very good question because it can be an uncomfortable situation to be in. One thing I didn't mention in my presentation is, I came to Canada. To keep things simple, I'm going to say I came to Canada as an adult and started my career here, and I had to do a lot of learning about Canada. And so in my first few years, I just kind of always assumed that my editors and the people that I worked with knew best, and I was there to learn from them. And then I had to unlearn that because I realized that there are a lot of things where I'd question, I think, is this really the best way to cover that story, or isn't this a little bit insensitive? But I kept thinking, no, they know best. And I think it's really good to go with your instinct. I had to unlearn that and then realize it is okay to speak out and question something, and to do so respectfully. And one thing that I can say right now is that the people who are most outspoken and most challenge us in the newsroom that I work in now are the emerging, younger, early career journalists who come in and challenge us to be more sensitive, to be more inclusive. And so I think, if anything, in whatever way that you feel comfortable, it's always okay to question something or to point out that the newsroom isn't diverse or that the coverage isn't diverse, and to think of ways to do it better. I appreciate it when people challenge me, and so I would hope that your experience would be positive as well. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Samya, and this so resonates with me. This is the age of challenge, and we can challenge respectfully. It's about me. If we're going to amplify those voices and tell stories that aren't being told, guess what? Those stories aren't being told. So we do have to push, but there's a way to do it respectfully. And I believe that, the advice and the strategies that we've shared today can hopefully help the listeners in learning how to do that. And it's all about curiosity. I think as a journalist, if you don't develop that curiosity, guess what? You're not going to feel that you can go into those places and find those stories, because the stories won't necessarily come to you. You've got to be curious. You've got to want to learn about other people. And that's how you're going to go out there. So we're going to continue with our Q&A here. So Mohamed, get the Q&A back up here. Give me just 1 second so I can get the questions and answers. So we have, thank you for your presentations. If you have any tips, we've got that one. What is one of the largest hurdles you've experienced to get to where you are today? Isaac, maybe we can go to you. Certainly your colleagues can weigh in, but that's one question that's come in.
So maybe I can tie that to actually the very first question that was asked too, is in terms of, it's mostly just getting to publications, right? Being able to get someone to accept your pitches and things like that. That's probably been the biggest. And really my answer to that, which ties right into the first question, is really in terms of developing contacts is what I was here to speak about. So once you have, whether it is your own communities or communities that you want to represent, and you're there and you're actually talking to people, you then have contacts and also the stories that you can actually pitch and talk to people about. And eventually they become important over time. That's probably the best advice I can give.
Anything, Marcus or Sammy, you'd like to add to that based on your experience and where you've gotten to?
I think to go back to what I was saying earlier, the biggest hurdle that I've come across is a lot of publications want someone who has daily news experience, and I don't have daily news experience since I left school or since I did my internship. So the biggest thing is finding ways to work on journalism, finding ways to get your stories accepted even when you're not working full time, and then balancing whatever side hustles you have to do with the journalism. I think that has been the most difficult thing, but I can say for me, things have been going well for the past couple of months, so I can see that work is paying off. So it's just a matter of perseverance and practice, I would say. Yeah.
And I can see you doing that side hustle. Right, and that's how you build that resilience, right? We heard it from Damila again. You're gonna hear no a lot. You're gonna hear no, but turn that no into a why not, and turn that no into I can't do this, into I can't do it now, or I can't do it yet. I don't know it, but I'll learn it. So you're gonna come up against a lot of obstacles, but don't give up. remember, the sky is your stepping stone. Samya, do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. Oh gosh, a micro hurdle that really applies to me, but I suspect to a lot of journalists as well, is that I'm a nervous public speaker. I'm nervous about approaching people.
You've done well.
Thank you. My comfort zone is very small, so it's very easy to step out of it and very hard to be out of it. And so, and I identify as an introvert. I'm sure I'm not the only introvert in this space right now. And so it's just been, years and years of work. I'd be in an interview and I just quickly zipped through my questions because I just wanted to be out of there. I was so nervous. And I've learned to kind of sit with that discomfort and learn to kind of sit it out a little bit and keep asking questions and not rush through an interview because I don't want to miss some key things. I want to learn how to listen to my speaker instead of thinking constantly, I just want to get out of here. So that was one, very basic thing. And another thing has just been sticking with it over the long term. So it can be very discouraging and to hear, about the media industry is always it's precarious to work in. I've been hearing that print is dying my whole life, and yet I've got a stack of magazines right next to me, all in print that I subscribe to. And so just kind of getting past that and thinking, living in the moment for me has been the thing. I've decided, you know what? Print may die in 20 years, who knows? But for now, I'm going to enjoy it while it lasts, and I'm going to enjoy getting to work in it while it lasts and just make the most of it. So those are my two things.
Thank you. And you're right. We've been hearing this for a long time now. Print, it hasn't died. And I think it's just evolving. And so it's a great point that you bring up in that know your audience and what they're reading and where they're reading it and where they're getting their information. And I think this is an opportunity where we can be really strategic in knowing if our audience is still reading print, then we've got a different way to position it. The immediacy of having these things at our disposal, and that's a different kind of news. It's not better, it's not worse, but there's value to the different ways that we can still receive our news. So thanks for that reminder. And speaking of reminders, you'll notice in the chat that my colleague Daniela, she's actually asking everyone before the end of the webinar today to fill out the participant survey. So please, if you haven't had a chance to do so, take a moment to do that right now. I'd like to thank all of you for participating with us today. I know that maybe you were told you had to be here by your professors, but I know that this topic was very important. It is very important to all of us. It's an impassioned topic because we want to make sure that the voices of Immigrant Canada are being heard and that the stories are being told. And we hope that you learned something today. I know that I learned quite a bit from my colleagues and industry experts, and I hope that you can take at least one thing away with you that can help you on your journey to becoming a better, more effective journalist, someone who will help tell the stories that aren't being told. Remember, we're all immigrants on this journey. We're all immigrants on this land. And on this journey called life, we're all trying to find our way and write our narrative and to share our stories. So as we walk along the path together, let us remember that the world is a wonderful place to be and can be a more wonderful place when we are seeing it through the perspectives of others, listening intently to their stories to help them become better human beings. I thank you for being with us today, and please don't forget to fill out the survey. Stay safe during these uncertain times. And if you want to learn more about New Canadian Media, I'm going to ask Daniela to please add a link to New Canadian Media in the chat. And I think we may have a couple more minutes for a few more questions, so we can definitely turn to the questions if there's any more that are coming in.
Mohamed, there's one question on the list that, if I may, there's a question about tips and advice for a young journalist who comes from another country and who's trying to start a career here. I get that question a lot, and I can really sympathize with it because there are a lot of people who come who might have experience abroad, but a lot of people don't kind of consider that legitimate here in Canada, which is unfortunate. And I don't have any strong advice, and maybe my colleagues can also speak to this, but one thing comes back to, I think what Marcus was saying about becoming a freelancer is very valid here, I think, is to just kind of develop your strengths as a journalist and find your beat. I think having a sort of beat or having a theme that you report on is really, really helpful because you can focus on, if you're interested in tech or if you're interested in the environment, finding the stories that you would like to pitch and really developing those and trying to, over time, develop your strength in one area. I hope you become identified with your strengths as a journalist and not immediately tagged as, oh, well, this is the journalist from abroad, so they don't know Canada as well. Show them, prove people wrong, prove editors wrong, producers, or whoever might be evaluating your pitches. That's my suggestion.
That's an incredible suggestion. Thank you. And again, maybe this is a pitch for us to tell you a little more about New Canadian Media. So you'll notice in the chat that Daniela did share information about how you can access information about New Canadian Media, maybe even joining the collective, learning about the mentorship program there. The reason we're having these opportunities with the schools is to give you the tools that you need, help you understand the perspectives that need to be considered so that you can tell the stories that aren't being told. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'd like to thank Isaac, Samya, Marcus, Tim and his team, Seneca, Kurt, thank you so much for allowing us to partner with you again, Kirsten and Ria and Daniela, all of you. And most importantly, I want to thank the students who have taken time today. Again, the message of remembering that the world is within your hands. And by that, I mean, you've got the opportunity to type away. Yes, we still do that. So tell those stories because we need your passion. We need your perspectives. We need you and Immigrant Canada, and the stories that aren't being told need you to become the medium through which they will be told. So thank you very much for joining us today. Wish you all the best. Stay safe and take care.